In this course, we took the first steps toward developing a web application, using it as an excuse to introduce ourselves to the development of any type of application. With GeneXus, the starting point was identifying the user's needs, which, although we didn't mention it here, are nowadays obtained from what are known as user stories and epics, both expressed in natural language. From these, the functionalities to be implemented are deduced, particularly the modeling of the system's entities, which are represented in GeneXus through objects. Transaction. Again, we can arrive at this manually or with the help of generative AI. Then, through symbolic artificial intelligence, GeneXus infers the relationships between the objects, which translates into modeling the database and its structures, tables, indexes, and relationships. And based on that modeling, GeneXus automatically generates, using symbolic artificial intelligence, that is, deterministic, the source code needed to actually create all of that, whether locally or in the cloud. So, the transaction object that we focused on studying in detail at the beginning of the course is fundamental because it gives existence to information within the system. It brings the entity into the system, building the necessary tables in the database, and contributing to the normalization of the database to maintain consistency. But that's not all. It also provides a screen for manipulating its data, with the logic to perform query operations on its tables, controlling uniqueness and referential integrity, and allows you to establish entity-specific logic through formulas, rules, and events. In addition, it adds automatic commit to handle transactional integrity. Therefore, it is a multi-purpose object. It covers both back-end functionalities, such as the structure of the database, everything related to CRUD operations, and the implementation of specific logic, as well as front-end functionalities. But, in addition, we saw that through the business component data type, which is obtained from the transaction, we could encapsulate back-end functionalities, leaving aside those of the front-end. This gives us great power to update the database through code, also ensuring consistency in that way. We didn't cover this in this course, but transactions can also be dynamic, in the sense that the data they manipulate does not necessarily come from the tables. The base of the transaction in the database created and maintained by the application, but rather from other sources. We mention it here so that you can look into it at another time. Since all transactions correspond to web programs executable in a browser, of course, GeneXus, in its automatic code generation, builds both the code that will run on the backend server and the code that will run in the browser, the front end. This is what we were doing incrementally each time we pressed F5, so we could quickly see the functional versions running. The idea is that the client can validate these versions and thus move the application forward in a more reliable way. But it's not convenient for users to work directly with transactions. They need a level of hierarchy among the entities that allows them to manage the data in an organized and visually clear way. These management screens are implemented with the GeneXus object used to display information, the web panel, and they follow a pattern in GeneXus known as work with. That's where we studied how, by applying it to a transaction object, we obtained other objects, mostly web panels. These objects together are the ones used. They begin to give shape to the web back office of our application. In that context, we saw that we could create web panel objects ourselves from scratch, allowing the user to interact with the information in whatever way we needed, without using patterns. These objects, like transactions, offer a screen to display whatever we want, on which we will explicitly place controls. And in addition, they have an event section where you can program both front-end code, user event code, for example, that doesn't require the server, as well as back-end code, such as the start, refresh, and load events. We mainly focused on the latter because they served as an excuse to introduce the most basic way to query the database, the for each command. It is the fundamental command in GeneXus for navigating a table and its extended table. This command expresses the same navigation logic for all events. All the other ways to query the database in GeneXus, which we later saw, are based on this, and that's why it was so important to study it. That's when two essential objects for backend development appeared on our radar, the procedure object and the data provider object. we studied their differences. We saw that the procedure allowed for procedural coding, whereas the data provider was declarative, and that it was more restrictive than the procedure because it always returned an output, and moreover, a structured output. That's when we studied the SDT data type. But later on, when we studied business components, we also saw that, because it is structured, that data type was valid as the result of a data provider. Then we saw that the procedure also allowed us to code CRUD operations through specific commands, which could only be used within the procedure object. And we compared that solution with the one we more strongly recommend, which is to perform CRUD through the data type, business component, which can be used anywhere, that is, both in transaction or web events, panels, as well as in the source of procedures. Then we saw how we could add an artificial intelligence agent object, which will be automatically created by GeneXus within Globant Enterprise AI in an almost transparent way and can be invoked in our KB similarly to a procedure. We used an example of this object to fetch information from the internet and use it to load data into the transaction, but this was just one particular use case. We also mentioned that the agent object can be used in the front end of a customer-facing application, for example, when implementing a chat. However, in this course, we focused more on the back-office application. That's why we ended up seeing how to incorporate the web panels we had been manually creating into the side menu. These panels were all loaded within a master page that contained that menu, and how a large part of the visual design was expressed in the design system object, which was based on the one called Unanimo, included in the GeneXus module that comes with the KB. However, regarding the user interface, we only covered the basic ideas. The course was strongly focused on the backend. That's why, towards the end of the course, we ended up adding the API object and ways to obtain data from external applications. In short, we covered the initial stages of developing a web application, specifically a back office, and that's where we left off. But, as we said at the beginning of the course, GeneXus enables continuous integration and deployment, automating the development and operations process from the conception of the web application to its launch in production. To achieve this, GeneXus provides tools that allow you to automate the solution lifecycle, such as GeneXus Server for team development and versioning, GXTest for modeling unit tests and the user interface, and it also integrates with MS Build to automate every step of the process. DevOps. Not to mention Nexa, the GeneXus assistant, which we've underutilized in this course, but is extremely important for speeding up development. Much of what we've developed manually in the course, now that we've learned it, we would do directly with Nexa, simply stating the requirements in natural language and at the highest level. And we would only focus on perfecting what it delivers. Since we had to learn the basics, we couldn't use it too much. But now that you know them, it's time to make the most of it. But there's much more. When it comes to application security, GeneXus offers the GeneXus Access Manager, or GAM, which automatically integrates authentication and authorization processes. Based on roles, it can be activated with just a couple of clicks in the KEB. In addition, it includes full support for industry standard protocols, allowing you to connect with all relevant identity providers. We mentioned that in this course we focused on the back office, and within that, just a bit on the front end and a lot on the back end. But we also downloaded the KB from the sample travel agency, where a web back office application very similar to ours had been implemented. But in addition, a customer-facing one implemented in Angular, which works with the same entities used by the back-office application, thus sharing the tables and therefore the data. But not the panels, which are implemented with the panel object for Angular instead of the web panel, which is similar to the panel but not identical. These differences apply to the front-end part of the application and not to the back-end, which is the code that runs on the server and is always implemented in .NET or Java. Nothing would prevent us from implementing the customer-facing application so that its front end is in .NET or Java instead of Angular. With the knowledge gained in this course, we would only need to go deeper into UI aspects to achieve this. For implementation in Angular, however, we also need to learn a bit more about the differences between web panels and panels. We have a specific course on developing applications in Angular with GeneXus that you can take. The world of panels is also that of native mobile applications. With those same objects, we can generate the application for Android or iOS. We also have a specific course to study the particularities of native mobile development. It is important to highlight that with GeneXus, we can truly implement multi-experience applications because they won't be independent applications, but will share everything that can be shared, and only the differences will need to be recoded. In any case, generally speaking, for the front end, we start from a design created in one of the design tools available on the market. For example, here in Figma, we have the design of 4 screens for the web application, the same ones for tablet as well as for phone. This design may have been created manually by a designer, as was the case here, or with the help of AI. And how do we bring it into GeneXus? In the sample, it was done manually. But it is also possible to import the design files directly into GeneXus, since it also has artificial intelligence to assist with this process, although for now it requires that certain conventions be followed in the original design. We also have courses that focus specifically on this from the designer's perspective. Lastly, we would like to highlight that although GeneXus allows you to build end-to-end applications, you can use it to implement only one part and use other tools for the rest. For example, you can use GeneXus to build the backend and, for the front end, develop directly in Angular, for instance, or vice versa, or even for each part of each component, since GeneXus is easily integrable. So, for example, when we studied the agent object, we saw that it was automatically registered in Globant. Enterprise AI, a business platform designed to facilitate the implementation of artificial intelligence assistants. And it acts as a bridge between different LLMs and the world of business applications in a secure and controlled environment. Thus, when the agent object in GeneXus receives a text in natural language, it connects to the artificial intelligence engine through Globant Enterprise AI. But this agent, once registered in Globant Enterprise AI, can be used not only from GeneXus, it becomes available for use by others as well. We strongly recommend taking the Globant Enterprise AI course to learn everything you can do to provide agent-based services to any application, whether in combination with GeneXus or not. We haven't mentioned it before, but in GeneXus we have an integrated BPM tool, Business Process Management, to implement workflows. We can even use agents there to make decisions within those workflows. And much more. We invite you to explore the various sites we offer, whether to take courses, watch videos, or access technical documentation. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this. It has been a pleasure to accompany you on this journey.